Welcome. I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel. Today we'll talk about the astrology of May 2021. I'm really happy it's finally spring just about everywhere, except of course, if you're in Australia or South Africa. Well, I wanted to say thank you to all of my patrons. I really appreciate all of your support. If you would like to become a patron and get early access to my astrology videos, as well as access to videos and materials that are never released to the public, and at the highest tier, if you would like to get the monthly magical elections, please mosey on over to patreon.com/Nina Griffin. All right, let's get started. So May is a much more eventful month and a much more serious month, I think, than April was. There were certainly intense moments in April, but there's something about May that really allows that astrology that happens in that month to kind of move mountains in a way that April really wasn't. Certainly the early part of 2021 was very serious and very heavy, and to some extent there is a return to that tone, although it's not quite so severe and I would say extreme as what we saw earlier in 2021. Now remember that at the very end of April, April 26th, we have a full moon at 7 degrees Scorpio, and because lunations, full moons and new moons are effective for 2 weeks, this full moon is going to be effective well into May until we get the following new moon. So I think it's worth sort of revisiting this full moon a little bit just to see what energy we're coming into May with. Now, that full moon, because it's at 7 Scorpio, a fixed sign, it will reactivate that Saturn-Uranus square, which is happening in fixed signs in Aquarius and Taurus. So places that have low herd immunity when it comes to COVID can probably expect cases to go up again in late April and certainly going into May. Now, the reason that Saturn-Uranus has to do with COVID is if you haven't watched my previous videos, which you probably should, certainly the 2021 forecast would be helpful. Saturn-Uranus hard aspects tend to be very much linked to pandemics. It was effective during the 1918-1919 Spanish flu or world flu pandemic that we had at that time. It tends to come up a lot when there is an increase of mass disease of whatever kind. So certainly for folks who are not vaccinated, this spring, this May especially, could be a higher risk period for COVID in a number of locations. Scorpio in particularly rules toxins because the scorpion is a poisonous creature. On the plus side though, it's not all bad. So in this full moon, the sun also conjoins Venus and Mercury. So for some, there might be an opportunity to return to school and to fun, which are the two significations of Mercury and Venus. You know, as with every full moon, it depends which side of the lunation you are on. Is it the moon side or the sun side? Sometimes they can be very different, other times they're the same. In addition to this influence, we'll also see April 27th, Pluto turning retrograde, and that's something that will also color certainly early May, if not really the rest of May and the next several months. You know, Pluto tends to rule, at least on the collective level, countries that are very large, very important, kind of the giants of the world. So I don't think it's always noticeable in our daily lives as individuals, but sometimes we do see this effect in international affairs, where a very large country might decide to take a more reactive or passive role around this time. So in late April, we would certainly see a large country sort of pulling back from a more confrontational or warlike footing, depending on the situation that they're in, instead of, pushing the envelope and sort of being more aggressive. Now, April 30th, that is an influence that is definitely going to carry over into early May. The sun is conjoining Uranus at 10 degrees Taurus. And this, of course, could give a dramatic announcement, discovery, some kind of shocking news. This could give a governmental action of some sort. And the reason that this is an important aspect is that very quickly after that, on May 3rd, so jumping into our May forecast now, we're going to have the sun square Saturn. And so the sun is essentially aspecting both Saturn and Uranus within just a few days of each other. So certainly we're going to see a renewed emphasis on those Saturn-Uranus themes, which, as I'm sure if you've watched my previous videos, you're well aware they have to do with COVID and the pandemic, but they also have to do with big changes in the world. Saturn square Uranus has a lot to do with anarchy on the one hand and repression on the other, and it's about, really this year is going to be about the global negotiation between those two extremes, and where on that spectrum do we land. Obviously, every country is going to be different. Some are far to one side, some are far to the other, and all of them try to land somewhere in a negotiated medium space between the two. But whenever Saturn and Uranus come to a square or are activated by a planet like the Sun, who aspects them both, you will find a renewed interest in this discussion. And this will probably lead to more conflict, more certainly debate and discussion, as well as additional confrontation. May 3rd, that is not the only event. We also have Mercury square Jupiter, and that happens at 28 Taurus and 28 Aquarius. And this is kind of an interesting aspect. It's not a hugely major one, but I think we're going to see a lot of discussion around, what does it mean to be living in the 21st century? What do we want the future to look like? As I've explained previously, Jupiter in Aquarius has a lot to do with infrastructure. It has a lot to do with the common good, things that we put in place that are intended to benefit society at large, rather than just individuals. And so Mercury square Jupiter again brings this discussion to the fore in early May. And we're going to see a lot of really, I think, interesting debate on where do we need to land on some of these ideas, and where do we want to go generally as a community, as a society, and so on. May 3rd, also, Mercury will enter Gemini. Now, of course, Mercury is in his own sign here. And for those of you who read my Magical Elections document, this is an excellent time to do your Mercury talismans once Mercury is in Gemini. So keep an eye out for good dates during that period. Now, in general, this means that commerce and school and really anything related to mercurial activity gets a lot more activity and is certainly a lot more prominent. So certainly in the United States, we've had students, especially the primary school kids, returning to school for some time, but a lot of places are just about to do this. So just as May rolls in, you'll see a lot more kids going back to school, really of all ages. May 4th, the very next day, Venus exits the rays. She has her heliacal rising. Now, what this means is that, as I've explained in other videos as well, when Venus, or really any other planet, exits the sun's rays, you get a much more noticeable increase in that planet's energies. It's kind of like they're not being overshadowed by the glare of the sun anymore. Suddenly they have their own identity. There's often some kind of important news or announcement or discovery that occurs when planets exit the sun's rays. Now, Venus, interestingly, is going to be in Taurus, so she's exiting the sun's rays, of course, on the occidental side. She likes being occidental, walking behind the sun. So it's kind of a lovely moment for Venus. She's going to be in Gemini very soon after this, but there's a real return to joy and socializing and all of these Venusian pleasures that perhaps had been closed off for a really long time. So I think that a lot of locations that maybe were either under lockdown or restrictions due to COVID, in early May, around that May 4th date, they might start seeing a little bit more of a loosening. It's definitely a very hopeful and merciful moment in what can often be a very challenging year. May 8th, so a few days later, Venus will square Jupiter, and that's going to be at 28 Taurus, 28 Aquarius. This is generally a positive aspect. People are sometimes afraid of squares, but generally when we have a square between the two benefics, and at least one of them is dignified or there's some reception going on, we generally have a really positive experience here. And this could be a lot of different things. This, I think, will have to do a lot with generosity. So there could be some kind of new plans or some kind of new initiatives announced that are good for a lot of people. They could be particularly good for women, since of course Venus is involved. But there's a lot of opportunity here on a personal level as well. It's not always an easy aspect, but the two benefics usually find a way to agree because they're both so friendly and agreeable. Even if their interests aren't completely aligned, they usually find a way to get along and go forward for everyone's benefit. So May 8th, we get Venus entering Gemini. So she leaves her domicile Taurus and she enters Gemini. So she loses a lot of dignity by doing this because she's going from a sign where she is very comfortable that she rules into a sign where she doesn't have a lot of rulership. So this is generally an opportunity, I think, to go out of the house a little bit, right? So this could, of course, manifest in a lot of different ways. It could be a return again to kind of more overt, I would say, commerce, because Mercury's sign Gemini is involved. Shopping, vacations, all of those kinds of things that are pleasurable, but have a more mercurial component than just Venus does. May 10th, we get Mercury in Gemini conjoining the North Node. And if you know the North Node, it magnifies and expands whatever it touches. So it tends to increase things. It's a multiplier. And with Mercury conjunct the North Node, I think this could be very good for the economy, for shopping. It's going to be certainly good for students as well, assuming they like being in school. But, there's going to be a real return in a lot of places, I would say, particularly the US, which resonates to the Gemini-Sagittarius axis. There is going to be a real return to people going to school, people making plans to come back to higher education, like universities, things like that. On a personal level, this could be a very good financial or business opportunity, as well as an opportunity to learn and study, right? All of those mercurial things that are just getting really emphasized with this North Node conjunction. Now, May 11th, we get the new moon at 21 degrees Taurus. Now, the moon is very strong here. She is exalted, so obviously this is a very powerful new moon when we get that every spring. The ruler of the new moon is going to be Venus, because she rules Taurus, the sign where the moon is, and Venus is in Gemini conjunct Mercury. So there's going to be, I would say, a fairly dramatic set of changes in the next 2 weeks that are leading up to the eclipse, which we have in 2 weeks and which I'll talk about. Certainly, again, business and school is going to get a lot of oomph and emphasis. So I think in terms of the things that are going to be on people's minds or in the news that are going to be dominating their minds, it's going to be those Venusian and Mercurial concerns, which in many ways concern things like commerce in a capitalist society, but again, school and learning. That's really going to be the theme this month. Now, May 12th, we get Mercury in Gemini, trine Saturn in Aquarius, and that's at 13 Gemini and 13 Aquarius respectively. So it's not the most powerful of aspects, but I think it continues that theme we saw come up starting May 3rd, where Mercury squared Jupiter. And again, now we're thinking about, okay, we want certain goals for our community, for our country, for the next several decades. So now we start thinking about the details, right? We put the pedal to the metal, I guess, and we start thinking about the real practicalities of how do we make these plans happen. Because it's a trine, it should make things go relatively easily. So it's a aspect of accomplishment of things occurring smoothly. And I think that with Mercury involved, there's definitely going to be some help in getting more ambitious or broader initiatives on the table and in front of people. Now, May 13th brings us one of the major events of this month, and that's going to be Jupiter entering his domicile Pisces. Now, this is his nocturnal domicile, so Jupiter in Pisces is a little bit more inward and more reserved than Jupiter in Sagittarius, his diurnal domicile, which is much more loud and in your face. Jupiter is only going to be in Pisces for a little over 2 months. So this is just a foretaste of really what next year, 2022, is going to bring when Jupiter is in that sign sort of for good, or at least for a much longer period. So I think there is an opportunity here to get a taste of the future. And I think this is very useful for those of us who are interested in the future, interested in prediction, because it gives you a little bit of a preview of coming attractions. Now, Jupiter in Pisces, I should first say, is magically extremely powerful. And Jupiter, of course, brings things like wealth, good fortune, abundance, healing. And so again, if you are interested in magic and you haven't gotten May's magical elections document, it's probably a good opportunity to get that, because there won't be very many opportunities this year for having a fantastic Jupiter talisman, so you might want to look into it. There's a real difference here in Jupiter and Pisces between that and Saturn in Aquarius, certainly Saturn in Capricorn. Saturn in Aquarius and Capricorn is very much about guidelines and guardrails and boundaries, and certainly, especially in Capricorn, walls. Whereas Jupiter in Pisces is all about dissolution of boundaries. So it's going to be a really interesting 2-month period where it just feels like all the rules, all those restrictions that have been in place for over a year in a lot of places, temporarily at least, sort of melt away. It's a really interesting and special, and I would say even spiritual moment. For those of us, I think, who are interested in personal transformation, what I call the personal alchemy of the spirit, I think this is a great opportunity, a great period during which you can do a lot of work to advance spiritually, to gain, I would say, spiritual gifts, things like that. Jupiter in Pisces is going to be very giving and very generous in a way that he really wasn't in Aquarius and certainly not in Capricorn. Now, May 17th, shortly after this, Venus conjoins the North Node in Gemini. So this is going to be I would say, a fun moment or an opportunity for fun and for joy. It could also be an opportunity for women to get ahead. You might see women in the news more in sort of a dominant or prominent role, but you also might see more of an emphasis on more feminine qualities, certainly the arts, certainly even things like advertising and so on, are going to be very prominent mid-month. May 19th, Venus in Gemini trines Saturn, and that's going to be at 13 degrees of their respective signs. And this is, again, an emphasis on, okay, how do we bring beauty and joy into our lives in a more structured way, right? Saturn will demand some kind of rules, some kind of structure. And so we want to make sure that we are having fun, but in a responsible and sustainable manner. May 20th, the Sun leaves Taurus, which is good because it's been activating that Saturn-Uranus square the whole time. So it's going to enter Gemini, right? It doesn't have a lot of dignity or power in Gemini, but in many ways, it's good when the Sun leaves Taurus because the Saturn-Uranus square really doesn't need any more encouragement to become intense. So I'm hoping that the last 10 days of May, even though I think there are going to be important moves and important events, I think some of that collective intensity that we saw in the first 3 weeks of May is going to fade away just a little bit since the Sun won't be there to kind of activate that. May 21st, immediately as the Sun enters Gemini, it will square Jupiter in Pisces. So I think there's going to be a bit of a navigation of liberation and a loss of boundaries. It's going to make this issue very prominent because the Sun illuminates whatever it touches. So I think there's going to be a real sense of, wow, you have all this freedom now. What are you going to do with it? How is that going to work going forward? May 22nd is a similar theme. So Mercury in Gemini will square Neptune in Pisces at 22 degrees. Now, so there is certainly a sense of fantasy, again, a lack of boundaries here. There could be some deception as well as self-deception involved, right? With these two planets involved, thinking is none too clear. There is a sense of, acting from a place of unconsciousness rather than a place of rationality and reason. However, May 23rd, there's a change that I think is going to emphasize this trend. So May 23rd, the Saturn is going to retrograde. Now that's going to be at 13 degrees Aquarius. So if you have important planets or points around the fixed signs, around 13 of the fixed signs in your chart, you might feel this. And you might also feel it if Saturn is your, say, natal Lord of the Year. This is something I do a lot with my clients. We look at the Lord of the Year and what it does across the year to figure out what happens to you during a particular year. Well, if Saturn is emphasized for you in 2021, you're probably going to feel this retrograde station of his. Because Saturn's turning retrograde and he is the planet of restriction, it's kind of like restrictions temporarily fall. This may not always be a good idea, right? We sometimes like a little bit of structure. We can't just go all loosey-goosey, but with Mercury square Neptune the day before, we essentially get this feeling around that 22nd, 23rd of May that there is not a lot of guidance. And so everybody just kind of does what they want. And it's a little bit of an anarchic combination. It's not aggressive exactly, but there is also not a lot of guidance, information given to people as to what they should be doing. Now, May 26th is our total lunar eclipse. And it's the first lunar eclipse of this year. It happens at 5 degrees Sagittarius. Now, the ruler of it is Jupiter. And of course, he's in Pisces. So that makes this a very powerful and very epic eclipse in some ways. Because Jupiter in Pisces, to me, is almost like the fairy tale placement of fighting evil, being good. It's kind of a very saintly placement. So a lot of what we're going to see around this eclipse is almost an old-fashioned discussion of what is good, what is evil. Now, the other thing that will happen, and I alluded to this in my newsletter, so, if you haven't read it yet, you might check it out if you haven't gotten it via email. One thing that we saw a lot of was when Saturn passed through Sagittarius 2014 through 2017, there was a real movement into things like populism. And it's very interesting. Saturn going into a Jupiter sign produced this interesting effect. So we had Brexit, we had, the right wing and Donald Trump in the United States kind of ascend during this period. But then in the last year, in 2020, as we started to get eclipses in Gemini and Sagittarius, a lot of these movements started to sort of either fall apart, depending on the place, or they started to sort of really, really put the brakes on and transform themselves into something much more low-key in other locations, such as in the UK. And so I think what will continue to happen in 2021, and we'll see that with this eclipse, is that a lot of people who were sort of raised up high during that Saturn in Sagittarius period are suddenly going to be called to a reckoning. Some of them have already sort of lost their positions as these eclipses sort of ground on in 2020, and I think we'll see more of the same in 2021. And, you can see how Saturn and the eclipses kind of bring people up and they bring them down, that real cycle of fortune, right, that we see in medieval and Renaissance thought in Europe, where, you're up for a little bit and then you're down. You're up and you're down. And there's that sense of anything could really happen, but the only thing that's certain is that it's not permanent and that everything changes. Now, May 29th, we're going to have Mercury station retrograde, and that's going to be at 24 degrees Gemini. So there's going to be, I think, a certain change of direction when it comes to commerce, when it comes to schools. And again, it depends on the location. Places where schools have been closed will reopen. Places where they have been open and can stay open, there's going to be maybe a change in how schooling is done. There's going to be maybe some planning for the future, but also a sense of revisiting the past. So I think that, for example, if you have kids in school, who are school age, be aware that at the end of May, there could be a different direction that is taken. It could mean that maybe there is a change in how summer vacation is handled. Lots of places I know in the US are trying to somehow make up a little bit of time by cutting summer vacation a little bit short. So there could be a shift in planning. So if you are making plans for the summer or even for later this year, you might want to wait until the end of May to see what that direction is going to be. Now, what's interesting is that last time that we had Mercury retrograde in Gemini was in May 2015. So it's been a while, it's been 6 years. And at that time, we got a royal baby in the UK. And so I'm wondering if there's going to be more like baby news or something like that associated with the British monarchy. At the same time, though, it was kind of a moment of a real of social progression, right? Social progressivism. So Ireland voted on the legalization of same-sex marriage in May 22nd of 2015. So there could be something similar going on for us somewhere around the world, right? A lot of discussion and negotiation of LGBTQ rights. Don't forget that Mercury rules people who are, for example, without gender or unclear gender or both genders, right? So I think that could be part of the discussion very much during this retrograde. I think there's also going to be an emphasis on what's going on in the stock market and with the economy. Mercury is a commercial planet, so some of the biggest economies, including the US, China, certainly the EU, will have sort of a moment of regrouping and figuring out kind of what they want to do next. There could be a change of direction through some of these large economies, just how they want to do the rest of this year and even the next few years. There could also be an additional rapprochement, if you will, between the United States and Cuba, because the last time Mercury was retrograde in Gemini in May 2015, Cuba was removed from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. So I'm kind of wondering if we're going to see another connection between the US and Cuba around this time. All right, thanks very much for watching. I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel.